Okay, let's. Okay, so we are waiting for people to join in. Uh, yeah. And it's raining. Snakes are crawling beneath. With the rain coming in, I'm pretty sure they're going to start coming out. Hello, Uncle. Hi, Akshay. Great. It's nice to see you finally join in. Uh, we'll just wait for a couple of more minutes and then we'll begin. I think there are a few more people joining in. I hope you guys are having a good Sunday. It's raining out here and it's suddenly the weather's become very cool. So that's really nice. Um, how's the weather otherwise in your cities? Same here. Looking really forward for this. This has been a very interesting topic, so I'm very excited. Hi, Sandeep. Great to see you join in. So yeah, I think we can at least begin with the introduction and all. So yeah, this is Mathematical. This is a series that we've started in collaboration with Cobalt Blue. Sandeep, Ruchi are the founders of Cobalt Blue, and you guys should definitely check out Cobalt Blue's other channels and other sessions and all. They do a lot of things around mythology, storytelling, art, and even wellness and all. Is something we've ventured into. Mathematical itself started off like a few weeks back. This came in conversation between me, Ruchi, and Sandeep, where we decided that how about we look at some of the mythologies and not just from Indian mythologies but across different mythologies. And the theme Mathematical, it's a play on the word myths and themes, because sometimes I feel that the best way for us to appreciate mythology is by looking at different mythologies and then coming back to it. As I keep saying, mythology is almost like cuisine. Asking someone your favorite mythology is almost like asking about your cuisine. And we all have some preferences. We all like something, but It depends on our mood, what we want to be consuming and all. And at the end of the day, we have certain things that is we consider as comfort food, which comes from our upbringing and all. As you can see, we're going to be talking about the slaying of serpents, and it's going to involve a lot about thunder and rains and all. And I think the universe is kind of aligning with that. Don't mind in case if the curtain crashes and all. This happens a lot in Bangalore. The water starts coming in. So that's what Mythematical started off with. We're going to be doing a lot more things. We've done some sessions already covering the flood myths, the time traveling myths. We've also talked about the fire, the theft of fire, the concept of fire being stolen. And today we're going to be talking about the slaying of the serpent. Mythological stories across the world about snakes as enemies. So just to begin with, I'm just going to put some context in. Now that I think we have enough people, there are themes and there are plot points which are common across many mythologies. Now, that's something that we all know, but how they are common and what is commonality and where do they deviate off is actually what makes mythology is very interesting. It also gives each culture its own identity, not just the similarities but the differences. But the fact that there are similarities itself is something to be talked about. It is something that we should consider as as an indication, as an insight to a more collective subconscious, a collective thought that we as humans have had. So the fact that snakes, right? I mean, if you think about it, snakes have been a part of many mythologies, and they have been in various degree of roles. Snakes are not just evil. In fact, snakes come as something to be worshipped. There are snake gods. There are humans that turn into snakes. There are snakes that are revered, and snakes that are good. And obviously, snakes have as much personality as most humans have in the mythologies. But the reason this particular theme is very interesting, the idea of a particular snake, not all snakes, but a particular snake being a sort of a nemesis or a rival or a mortal enemy of a god or a hero. This is something that's very prevalent. It's extremely prevalent, even more so in the Indo-European mythologies. When I say Indo-European, we're talking about the mythologies that spread across from the Europe all the way to Asia and all. Because anthropologically speaking, the humans, when they were migrating from Africa and they were moving towards it, there are certain commonalities that comes in. And I think the fact that mythologies have common elements is sort of a testament to the fact that they all come from a common origin. Politically, it's always a question of which one came first. I mean, we have people who want to believe that the Vedic stories and the Indian stories came first, while there's another thing that certain stories in the West, the Mesopotamian, the Egyptians ones were first. But again, the war of what came first is more to do with what we want to see rather than what it actually is. So this story, the idea of slaying of a serpent, I must tell you that, and this is something that's always common for me, especially in these sessions. It took me more time to figure out which stories to talk about, to choose only 3 stories, because there were more than 17 or 20 stories which had a slaying of a serpent. Just looking at Indian mythology itself, there were many stories. In fact, while talking about this session, I got a lot of people telling me, why don't you talk about this particular story, or the story of Takshak and Parikshit, to Krishna and Kalya, and there were a lot of others that were pointed out. So I want to just be clear, the reason I didn't choose those stories and I chose 3 different stories was because those stories are not exactly about a epic clash between 2 individuals, nor do they end with slaying. Second of all, the idea was to explore a common theme that was going on. So the stories I have settled on for this talk is going to be the story of Thor and Jormungand, which is from the Norse mythology, the story of Ra and Apep from the Egyptian mythology, and the story of Indra and Vritra from the Vedic mythology. So there are certain characters and commonalities you will feel, and we will definitely discuss that in more in detail. So just going about it, I want to say that there are a lot of other mythologies that had it. I mean, the Hittite mythology has a story of a storm god killing a giant serpent. There are stories in the Greek mythology where Zeus kills Typhon. There's also stories in the Japanese mythology about a storm god killing an 8-headed serpent. So, I mean, if I have to go forward, I'll, there are a lot of stories. I'll definitely be sharing that at the end of the video and putting it in the comments, some of the other stories for anyone who's more interested. Yeah, but I think it's interesting to discuss 3 distinct stories in their own way, which talk about how a god ended up slaying a serpent. So let's begin the wars, right? So the first story we'll talk about is a story of Thor versus Jormungand. This is a story from Norse mythology. Loki and his deeds, Loki being a god of mischief, has often been forgiven, but this time he has crossed his line. His playful mischief has now finally led to a death and the murder of a god, Baldur. And for that, he's being punished by being tied up in the cave with snake venom dripping on his forehead. He's writhing in pain, and every time he moves, it causes what we feel as earthquakes. But with each jerk, the bondage of the trickster god is weakening. He's plotting his revenge. He's going to unleash the destruction on the gods who tried to control him. But he's waiting for a right moment, a right time. Ragnarok. It's a future event that will bring upon the apocalypse in the Norse world. And he's not alone in this. For you see, he has sown the seeds that will spur and cause the chaos in the world in form of his own 3 children. There is the wolf. So I'll just show you all these this for the namesake and all. So Loki has one child, a wolf. Then there is another child, a girl, and one child which is the serpent, Jormungand. Now, for most of the gods, when they saw this abomination, they tried to control it. They tied up the wolf in their own home, the Asgard, where all the Norse gods live. They banished the girl to the icy cold world, where she's ruling as the Hell Mistress, and they cast out the snake into the sea that surrounds all the lands. So Jormungand was finally the snake that was encircling the world, and it keep growing bigger and bigger, and it's so big it grew that it finally was able to reach its own tail, and so hungry it got that it began to eat it, and thus it was encircling the world again and again as the time went on. Now there are three encounters it has with the god Thor in the stories, each of which leads to a deeper animosity between the two, the creature and the god. The first one happens when Thor is visiting a giant's palace, and he's been challenged to do a deed. He's been asked to prove his strength by lifting up a cat. For a mighty warrior like Thor and a god himself, this seems almost insulting. So he tries to lift up the cat from its belly, but the cat is end up arching its back in such a way that the more Thor lifts it up, the more it arches its back. And Thor is not able to do anything more than just lift up maximum of one of its paw. And after a lot of trying and all, Thor gets very, very tired and exhaustingly gives up. It's not until he's leaving the castle that the giant tells him that it was a very impressive deed for him to have been able to even lift up a paw of the cat. For you see, the cat wasn't actually a cat. It was Jormungandr. It was in disguise. And when Thor was lifting up the cat, he was almost lifting up the serpent up to the skies. And at one point in time, when it was able to lift up the paws, Thor was at a risk of changing the entire boundaries of the cosmos itself. And because of this, Jormungandr did not like being pushed around this way. He wanted to know who had dared to do so. Now the second encounter comes up when Thor is going fishing with the giant, and again, soon enough, this turns into a fishing contest. Goaded by the giant, Thor decides to get a bigger and a bigger fish. So he, despite the protest of the giant, decides to venture out deeper into the sea. He takes up his fish line, takes up one of the cattles of the giant, breaks the skull, puts it as a bait, and throws it into the sea. Soon enough, it catches something. It starts tugging, and despite Thor being one of the strongest gods, he feels that it is fighting him. It must be something really, really big, and soon enough, it is revealed that it is Jormungandr itself. The two beings, Jormungandr and the god Thor, are face to face with each other. This time, without any disguise, Jormungandr is dripping with poison and blood, having been called from the water, while Thor reaches out for his hammer. And just as when he's about to strike it, the giant cuts off the rope, cuts off the line, the fishing line, which lets Jormungandr go slipping back into the watery depths and resume its positioning of encircling the world. Jormungandr didn't like being pulled around this way, but this time he knew who had dared to. Now the third time this finally happens is Ragnarok. This is something that is yet to happen, but it surely will. For you see, Ragnarok is something that is inevitable. It's a time where the arch enemies are going to finally and fatally meet each other. It's the end of everything. All the gods, the giants, the humans that have lived ever since Yggdrasil, the world tree, the tree that had the 9 worlds, including the world that we live in, Midgard, that is our world, and Asgard, that's the god world, that had come into existence, and this tree was now shaking. The first sign of Ragnarok is the 3 consecutive winters that happen in Midgard, and the ice world takes over our planet. The second sign of Ragnarok is when the sun and the moon get swallowed by the wolf who has broken from its chain and swallowed the 2 entity. With its flaming nostrils coming from swallowing the sun, it sets half the world ablaze, and it ends up clashing with Odin, that is Thor's father, before devouring him completely. It is only when Odin's another son fights with Fenrir that Fenrir is destroyed. The third sign of Ragnarok is Jormungandr releasing his own tail, taking off the bite, and then thrashing its way onto the land. While it does so, it sprays the poison that fills up the skies and the seas, the other half of the world. Anything the poison touches dies. So all the life forms in the sea and in the skies are extinguished. Thor does not like this. For you see, he's a protector of Midgard. He's a protector of our world, and he's a god of Asgard. And he takes up his hammer, Mjolnir, and he charges at the serpent. With many strikes, he will finally be able to smash the serpent's brain before cleaving the head off. But you see, this is not exactly a victory. For as Jormungandr will die, it will empty the venom sac that will fill around the god of thunder. The god of thunder is only going to be able to take 9 steps, grunting in pain before completely collapsing, lifeless, being poisoned by the very creature it slew a few moments ago. There will be other battles and other casualties that take place in Ragnarok, such as Loki fighting Heimdall, one of the other gods himself, before killing each other. But this is how the world is going to end, with ash, blood, darkness and ice, involving a god who will slay the serpent. So that was the story of Norse mythology, the Ragnarok, where Thor finally meets Jormungandr. Just a couple of points. Jormungandr, a lot of people say Jormungandr, but the J is pronounced Y, like many of the East European languages and all. So this myth, the reason this is all told in the future, if you have noticed, even the narration was done about the future, and it's an interesting thing because Ragnarok is not something that has happened. It is something that is prophesized. In fact, it's something that is only told to Odin by a seer who tells how it's going to happen. So what's interesting about Norse mythology is that the gods are very aware of the fact that there's something like this is going to happen. They may not know the details, but they know they're going to die. And it's one of the only mythologies where everything dies. And finally, from the ashes and all, there are two humans that come out and they ultimately repopulate the earth. There are a couple of god survivors and all, including Thor's children, that do. But to be honest, this could also be more of a Christian retelling of trying to appropriate the Norse mythology by making it the idea of two gods, a few gods surviving and two humans surviving and all. A lot of the stories of the Norse mythology has been lost to us. In fact, even these stories that come from Poetic and Prose Edda were written centuries after the Norse world was almost collapsed, and it was written with monks who had encountered some of the Vikings attacking them and all. So there is a little bit of misappropriation and a lot of information loss. Yeah, so this was the story of Thor and Jormungand, the first story. We can move to the next story. In case you have any questions, do feel free to put it on the comments and all. I'll be definitely taking up questions, and if there's something specific you want to discuss, I can definitely do that. Moving on to the other story. Now, just remember, we just spoke about a myth that is yet to happen. The next story I'm going to tell you is a story from the Egyptian mythology, and the story is more interesting because in a way, myths are something that we always see as something that is set back in time, right? It may be happening again, but it's something that has happened, right? Ragnarok broke that thing where it's something that is going to happen. But this story, the story of Ra in Apep, is even more convoluted because it's something that is happening. It is something that is going on every day right now. And that's something that we have to grapple with because the story is not something that had happened before, but is something that is happening again and again, which also means we as humans have a role to play in this mythology. But before we get to what is happening, let me tell you how we came to a situation like this. So, the story of Ra and Apep begins before creation, because before creation there was chaos. Now, chaos did not have any form or purpose, but then it got to be called Apep, and it took the form of a snake. In fact, Apep is referred as he who was spat out, because that is what Apep, the name, what it means. It was a job of the Egyptian gods to dispel the darkness of chaos and replace it with order and light, harmony and balance. In fact, in Egyptian mythology, there is a concept called Maat, M-A-A-T, which means the idea of harmony, order, balance. A simpler way of thinking about it is think of an Egyptian version of Dharma. That's what it is. There is a god, Maat itself, but generally in many of the mythologies, Maat is something that the gods carry with them. Very similar to Indian mythology, where there is the Dharmaraj, but then it's also a thing that is prevailing and all. So it is the god's job to be doing this. Some say that Apep is trapped in the underworld. He was probably the previous chief god before Ra, the sun god, dispelled him out. Now, Ra, the sun god, he's also the bringer of light. He's the upholder of Maat, the idea of balance, harmony, and justice. So, it isn't surprising that he's the natural enemy of Apep. Apep waits for his chance in the underground for his revenge. It is thought that it is his terrifying roars that cause the underworld to be rumbling. Now, just to make you understand, Ra, because he's the sun god, he carries a sort of a sun disk on his head, which the Egyptian world is divided into 24 kingdoms or 24 Egyptian hours, 12 on the top and 12 in the underground. What Egyptians believe is that the Ra himself in his sun boat, carrying the solar orb, travels during the day across the sun, providing light, and then goes into the underworld, journeying across before coming back again. So each day, Ra is carrying the sun disk across the sky where he's busy providing the light, and each night the sun god is traveling to the underworld before coming back through the east. Now, crossing the underworld also means crossing all the 12 gates that belong to different kingdoms and the different hours, which have different rules altogether. Apep kind of knew this. He knew that Ra has to travel and bring back the sun to the sky from the east. So every morning, Apep hides at the base of the 11th, sometimes the 10th gate, at the base of Baku the mountain, which is a mountain famous in Egypt, where he tries to defeat Ra from ever rising again. In his battles, Apep is thought to have a sort of a magical gaze that could hypnotize Ra, and he attempts to devour him by choking the river and engulfing the boat itself. The thing is, if Apep succeeds, the world will completely go into chaos. And for this reason, while going through all the 12 gates, Ra is assisted by many, many other gods who kind of help him. And one of them is none other than Set. Set himself, who's the only one known to be immune to the serpent's hypnosis. Now, it's a little ironic that Set is someone who's called for help. Just to give you the absurdity, it's almost like in Indian mythology, calling a character like Duryodhan being asked by Vishnu to come and help him out with solving the world problem. Or in Game of Thrones, it's almost like going to Cersei and asking her to help with the White Walkers. For you see, Set is often the antagonist in many other myths. He's known to have murdered his own brother, usurped the kingdom, caused a lot of problems amongst the other gods and all. So it's something that is a very interesting thing, but it also tells you that because Set is called the gravity of the situation, what the gravity of the situation must be, because his evil, Set's evil, is pale in comparison to the evil that Apep brings. And like the other gods, even Set does not want the world to completely go into chaos. So every time Ra, Set, and gods are sailing through the underworld, they encounter Apep, who's trying to swallow the boat. Many times, Set ends up boasting. He ends up, trying to boast about the fact when he's trying to defend the boat. Every day I slay the serpent, the enemy of Ra. When I stand at the helm of the boat, where no other god does, back off, fiend, for the onslaught of Ra's light. If you speak, your face will be overturned by the gods. Apep manipulatively cries, and then he concedes, I will perform your will, O Ra, O Set. I will act properly. I will act peacefully, O Ra. And just as when they are sailing past Apep, he taunts Set, reminding him of all the ways the other gods have treated him, which causes Set to completely lose his mind and strike Apep. And Apep ends up recoiling and slithering away, allowing them enough time to pass. Set is often heard saying this back, your head is crushed, O groundling, your bones are broken up, and your flesh is cut up. Ra has consigned you to the earth, O Apep, enemy of Ra. Apep's his movements are thought to be what causing earthquakes according to us. And his battle with Set is an explanation of what we hear as thunder, what probably you can hear outside right now. A few times, Apep does manage to swallow the sun boat and causes the world to go into chaos. It's something that what we believe scientifically as solar eclipse, but in actuality it's just Apep swallowing up the sun god. And eventually the only way Ra and Set and all the other gods are able to escape is they cut open the belly of the serpent and freeing the golden orb to rise up for another day. In fact, one time Apep managed to swallow the boat in such a way that it took Ra to take up a form of a giant cat, a creature that is so revered in the Egyptian mythology. They have their own deities that are in the form of a cat, and it slew the serpent with its claws. But despite being killed, Apep is able to return each night, since he lives in the underworld, which is the world of dead. So he's dead already. And he's always there, waiting for the night to return, waiting to meet his rival, looking forward for a time when he shall finally prevail instead of getting slaughtered. So that was the other story of the Egyptian myth about Ra and Apep. What's interesting is also that the only way the Egyptians believed that to help the sun god completely go through the transformation. In fact, it's very important to understand the sun god is not the same. Every time he's engulfed, he's reborn. It's almost like a new being of the thing. So it's not like it's the same Ra going again. The basically Ra is dying and he's coming back again. And what is believed in the Egyptian mythology is that the Egyptian priests were the one who would chant prayers for Ra, for supporting Ra and cursing Apep. They would make effigy of the snake, and they'll try to destroy it as a way to curse and perform an anti-worship of the snake, just to ensure that the Ra has enough power to come back the other day. Because they believe that the sun, every time it sets down, there's a chance it may never come back again. In fact, there is an annual rite in Egypt called Bashing of Chaos, where the priests built up a statue and they finally burn it as a way to burn the evil of Apep every year. So that was the story of Apep and Ra from the Egyptian mythology. I hope you enjoyed that. That was something that, again, as I said, it's not something that has happened. It keeps happening. So right now, in a few hours, Ra is finally going to go back, fight Apep, and hopefully, fingers crossed, come back again. So that's the story. We'll move on to the last story. The last story is a very interesting one, and I must tell you that it was very hard for me to find the last story, because it comes from the Vedic stories. Now, I'm going to call Vedic mythology separate from the Puranic mythology. We Hindus tend to have this idea of saying Hindu mythology or Indian mythology is only this thing, but you have to understand the religion of Vedic period is very different from the religion of the Puranic period and the later religion that came in. Hinduism has evolved. In fact, it wasn't Hinduism. It was a sort of the Vedic culture was something very different. It did inform, and there are a lot of elements that came out. In fact, in the story you're probably going to hear a lot of characters that you have a different association with. So I'll ask you to keep an open mind, because don't think of these stories as a precursor for what was going to come. Take these stories as it is, and just remember that they finally evolved into something else altogether. What I also want to point out, and this is just something about Vedas itself, Vedas are very, very hard to read. In fact, one of the ways anyone interested in mythology will tell you is that the reason Puranas even came because Vedas were so esoteric. They were so meant only for the upper crowd, only for the Brahmanical. It was so hard to consume that the stories weren't actually reaching out to the common people. The Puranas were a way for reaching out some of the messaging or some of the core principles that Vedas had just touched upon, bring it out in surface and finally reach to people. This was also done as a way, as a sort of this was done as a way to combat other religions like Buddhism, other things that were coming in for supremacy and dominance of a certain religion. Vedas are reading a story in Vedas is almost like reading a half-written film review and trying to decipher what happened in the film. It's almost like listening to a prayer and then trying to infer, listening to Hanuman Chalisa and deciphering the whole Ramayana, what happened. You will be able to get some idea. But to be honest, because the structuring of it is so different, it's basically invoking of a god. It's basically talking to a god. It's talking about a god. And the way some of the stories come out is basically by the god being called out for all the deeds he's done. So it's a little incoherent. It's almost like, when you're reading through the Vedas, you come across a certain line, you're like, wait, this god did this? What is this? What does this mean? And then you refer back and you find out that it's not been mentioned anywhere else. So I would always tell you to take it with a pinch of salt. Many of even the story that I'm going to tell you is, I would say, 60% based on my inference and 40% based on where I could find. I definitely found the story. There are hymns and verses. There are mandalas. The Rig Veda chapter 1 does mention Indra and Vritra. So there is a story to it. But unlike the Puranic stories and most of the stories we hear right now, these stories are fragments talking about, they're referring to a story that is almost lost to us. So yeah, with that, let's begin the story of Indra and Vritra. Vritra, the serpent, has kept the water up, the Hindi word for water, of all the world captive. None of the other gods could free the water and had given the task as a lost cause. Only a cataclysmic event could achieve that even gods could not cause right now. The world needed an arrival of a new, more powerful god that ever existed or was ever to come. It needed the arrival of Indra. This was foretold that the greatest god in the world is about to be born. But the goddess Earth, who bore Indra, did so for almost 1,000 months and many, many autumns and hid him for reasons unknown, deeming him completely unworthy. She passed his embryo. Yeah, so that's goddess Earth. She passed the embryo of Indra to a being called Kusava. Now, in the stories, Kusava sounds like the name of a river, but it's not very clear. So Kusava, who finally developed this embryo more favorably, but Indra was defying the ancient and accepted way for gods to have come. Something was very different about him. This god, Indra, was aware of his immediate task to accomplish. He knew that he was here to slay the serpent Vritra and to release all the water held by him. And he had come out fully formed. Indra, out of his own violation, insisted of being delivered the unusual way, eventually causing the death of Kusava. Kusava, so incapacitated, was being unable to deliver a newborn child, was struggling for life as he delivered a fully formed deity. Worse still, Kusava's husband, Vyamsa, tried to do everything to kill this newborn, but Vyamsa was struck to the ground and smoted by Indra, but not before he broke Indra's jaw. Undeterred, Indra had crushed Vyamsa's head. After all, even at birth, Indra was fully endued with all the heroic valor. As soon as he was born, he sprung up and assumed all the garment and breathed in. He could sense the world, he could feel the earth, he could feel the heavens. Having widowed Kusava, Indra took one last look at her as she laid almost dying. But what was ordained had to be fulfilled, and even a dying mother could not bind a god. He hurried towards the dwelling of Twashtar. Twashtar basically was a artisan god. He is sort of like a blacksmith and maker of divine instruments. So he finally reaches the dwellings of Twashtar. Twashtar starts working and fashioning and refining a thunderbolt or Vrajadhut, which Indra becomes very skilled in using. Meanwhile, Indra starts drinking this enormous amount of som, which is an intoxicating drink that he found at Twashtar's place, and it soon becomes his favorite. Now, the orphaned god, he's been forsaken by all the other gods for his parricidal crime of killing his parents. He turns around to his only friend, Vishnu, who happens to be at the dwelling, telling Vishnu, "Oh friend, stride full boldly forward." Vishnu, on hearing Indra, prepares the space for the battle by taking 3 steps and 3 strides, for which later on he becomes very famous. In fact, there are 2 other devas who are mentioned, Varuna and Agni, who Indra is able to coax and ask him to aid him in the battle against Vritra. It is indicated that they were actually on the side of Vritra, who they called father. But Indra was able to convince them to fight. Indra then goes and destroys the 99 forts of Vritra by mounting and charging on an elephant called Airavat. Vritra breaks Indra's jaw again. So it's not very clear where, like it's the same jaw, it was the other jaw, but he breaks them during the battle. But before taking another hit, Indra strikes the bolt at the creature that meets his underbelly, spurring out all the water and releasing it to the world. As Vritra tries to writhe in pain, it is thrown down by Indra, and in falling, it is crushed by the remnants of its four shattered forts. But before anyone could celebrate, Vritra's mother, Dhanu, attacks. However, she is defeated by Indra with his thunderbolt. The mighty elephant Airavat reaches down his trunk into the watery pool that is seeping now the underworld and sucks the water before spraying it out on the cloud, which causes the Indra to cause the rain to come down and thus linking the water of the skies to the underworld. There's an awkward silence as the battle comes to a halt. Seeing Indra stand victoriously in front of the slain carcass of Vritra in the rain, just as the prophecy said it would, the Devas are not really sure of what they witnessed. With great pride, the goddess Earth exults, "With his great thunderbolt, my son has slaughtered Vritra and set forth the rivers free to wander." And this single-handed accomplishment of his son is so much pride she has that she ends up mocking the other gods. She says, "Are the gods addressing him with the words of welcome? Are they to tell thee that the floods are saying, 'What gridling rocks the water burst asunder?'" Hearing this and realizing their mistake for not being much of a help, the other gods start praising the valor of Indra. For this feat, Indra is known as Vritrahan, the slayer of Vritra, and is finally revered amongst all the gods. So this was the story of Indra and Vritra. I must tell you a couple of things that come out. In fact, there's like a specific mention of this about him slaying a serpent, and then there's like a longer paragraph about Indra's birth. I did not know about Indra's birth myself for a long time until I found out during my research. It's important to understand in the Vedic stories, Indra is not an object or a personification. He's not rain himself. He's an agent who causes rains. He causes the lightning and he causes the river to flow. In fact, before his importance and his significance diminishes in the Puranic literature, especially when the Vishnu Puran, Shiv Puran, and all the Bhagavatam Puran and all come out, where he's reduced to being a hedonistic Deva king, insecure about losing his power. Indra is very revered in the Vedas. He's the one who's mentioned most of the times. In fact, in Puranas, it's his friend Vishnu who becomes more famous, almost taking on a new persona, a new god, and Indra just being reduced to being a king of god, always seeking power. What's also interesting is the word Indra, the name Indra, the roots come from the word Indu, which is raindrops, because this is how in the Vedic stories he believed to have captured the rain. He goes on to even defeat Vritra's brother Vala, and get this thing, the Vala is a cave. So a serpent's brother is a stone cave, which Indra finally breaks down. And there's a story where he liberates the cows and Usha, the god of dawn, that was hidden there. He gets the help from Samara, Samar, which is his divine dog. So that's another story that is almost parallel to this that comes about. Yeah, so that's the story of Indra and Vritra. I hope you found the story interesting. I must say that between all these stories there is a lot of commonalities. You must have seen the idea of a god trying to fight the gods and all. So I must tell you that in terms of I found some themes that are very, very interesting, because if you think about it, the idea of a god fighting a serpent, and it's something that is so common that in mythologies that there's actually a term for it called Chaoskampf, which is a German word for the battle of chaos, which involves a god trying to fight a serpent and in so helping rain, bringing rain, or fighting rain. And I found it very interesting that there's almost a Germanic word for this term which describes this Indo-European mythology commonality. But the idea that this is always a conflict of chaos. So I want to bring up a very interesting thing that I found between the three stories. if you see this fight between the god and the serpent as a fight between chaos, a fight between chaos and order. The first story, the story of Thor and Jormungand, is a story of consequential destiny. You cannot escape it. It's something that is going to happen, and finally, it's going to result in death. The story of Ra and Apep is about collaborative duty. One god is not alone to be able to solve it, so you need help. Almost like the Avengers call in the Marvel movies, where all the gods need to come to solve the problem. And this is a story of rebirth, because every time they die, they have to come back and they have to fight a new way. The story of Indra is the story of collateral damage. It's a story that because something had to happen, someone had to die, someone was saying there were people who got, Indra's own parents were killed and all, but it's a story of life, something that finally comes, because with water comes life. What I think we can take away from these stories itself is the idea that we are always fighting chaos. We are always in combat, in opposition to the unknown, to the darkness that engulfs us. The only way we can ever acknowledge and to do that is by remembering the fact that we cannot escape it. The conflict is inevitable. It's always going to be there, and we need to do that. It's also something that we don't have to do it alone, which is always important, which is the reason we need each other. The idea of a hero, the hero may be within us, but finally when we are trying to fight, we need to acknowledge the hero in someone else too. And the third thing is that we need to do it no matter what the cost is. Because in the end, fighting the darkness is something that must be done. We cannot run away from it. We cannot hide from it, because finally that is how the world does work. So the idea of snakes in these stories are basically the idea of problems that we face in life. Right now, in the COVID time, we are facing a lot of problems. The pandemic is the chaos that is bringing. We don't know what it has to offer, what it is going to take away. We know that it's a problem, but the way to do this is to do it together, to finally acknowledge the fact that we can't escape it, and to go through it no matter the cost. Because the only way to get over it is to get through it. Yeah, so that was the stories of the serpent myths. If you guys have any questions, I'll be looking. I think I'm reading the things. I find it interesting, some people have joined in. Any questions you guys have that you want to discuss? While you are typing your questions or you have any things, just a couple of interesting things. One of the things I've asked, a lot of people had this question about was that, what about the Beowulf story of dragon and all? If you notice, I didn't, mention a dragon, but if we expand the stories of serpent to dragon, in fact, in many translations, Vritra or Jormungand has been described not as a serpent, but as a dragon. One of the interesting wormholes I went into of research was this idea of what is the genesis of dragons. Dragons are something that have been, that can be traced back to the 13th century of, in English, the word Draco is actually a Greek word for serpent and dragon. The Chinese have obviously a different myths for dragon. Dragons are some bringer of rain. They're actually good creatures. Dragons are heroes themselves. But the Western stories, the Germanic, the European stories, the American stories and all, they are basically where the dragon is a monster to be slain. So if you expand the definition of chaos from that perspective, the idea of slaying the dragon comes from that. I see a question. Akshay, you asked me the question, how do I go about my research? Well, to be honest, I mean, it involves a lot of reading and going through a lot of materials. I go online. I do try to find the original text to do that. It also involves a lot of crying because I don't understand some of the text and some of the translations. A lot of frustrations. I would say it's 60% actual research, 20% crying and 10% banging the wall to figure out what it all meant. But if I'm being serious, the research also is somewhere where I talk to a lot of people. I start also trying to see what are the different ways a person is, how are different mythologies have been heard. When I was doing this research and when I was trying to think of topics, the mathematical topics are something that I'm just coming up with when I'm like I'm finding new stories, reading a lot of books, reading books from whether it's Dedra Patnaik books to reading Stephen Fry books. Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology was definitely an inspiration. It was able to help. In fact, I must tell you that what something struck me was the fact that Ragnarok, the chapter of Ragnarok, is also written in future tense. It's always about what will happen, and I was very I just love the fact that Neil Gaiman was someone who's mindful of that in his storytelling, as something that has not happened yet, but something going to happen. And obviously, I am talking to a lot of people online, on various groups, trying to figure out research and all. So it does, the research is obviously this thing. It is for me an excuse to actually be indulging in mythology. So for me, the research is also based on every time I find a particular story, I make some notes and I try to synthesize it. So yeah, that's how I go about it. So yeah, so that's what I was telling you. And the idea of a dragon was something that I was trying to bring forth as in many stories, dragons, the idea of a serpent with legs and arms and this thing comes out. In fact, it's one thing very interesting about dragons is that in many stories, dragons are associated with rain, not with fire. Fire is something that actually is more of a Western concept that finally gets relayed back into the Chinese mythology and all. But what's interesting about the dragon and all is that there is a commonality. There is always a sort of a switching between the term serpent and dragon, which means that many of these stories must have come from seeing a large serpent, and mythologies have a tendency of meandering and coming up with more stories, which is why finally, you have stories where some monster which was a creature becomes another thing. In fact, I must tell you that there's a very interesting thing in mythology, that marginality equals monstrosity. Anything, any person or any being we are not familiar with turns into monsters. That is why in Hindu mythology the asuras are depicted monstrously, the dragons are depicted monstrously. So it's a very important thing to understand that mythologies have a tendency of monsterifying the unknown, the people you don't know really well. The question about mythology as cuisine and what is your favorite cuisine. So again, if I have to talk about cuisine myself, I would always say that I love my favorite cuisine is Mughlai cuisine, but then that doesn't mean that I don't seek out pizza and all. So it depends on my mood. But if you're asking me about my current mood, recently I think I'm slightly more obsessed with the Mesopotamian mythology, the Babylonian mythology, the Gilgamesh and all. It's something that is starkly very different. It cannot be clubbed into the Western mythology of just a simple quest. The stories about a god meeting his rival and becoming best friends and having his best friend being taken away, then chasing immortality. There's flood myths. There's also the gods who do something and then they they get very frightened that we shouldn't have done this. There's a very different nature altogether. So currently in Babylonian mythology is becoming my favorite. But having said that, like any cuisine, there is the Hindu mythology is something I always refer back to. It's the comfort food. It is the dal chawal or the roti sabzi that you can say of for me, because finally we always go back to what we're comfortable with. Though I'm trying to explore other mythologies, trying to taste it, and also I think like cuisine, it's also fun to mix mythologies. It's very important to know where the mythologies come from, but it's also important to inclusively retell the mythologies. Tell your mythology, tell the mythology that you understand, bring it on your own way. So that is something that's very, very important. I think the idea of snakes as protectors is very common. In fact, that the idea of snakes as protectors is so common that the idea of dragons as hoarding gold is actually evolved from that idea. It is the thing that finally the idea of snakes are also associated with fertility because they are always on the ground and all. They're associated with immortality because they shed their skin. So humans believe that snakes are able to always be immortal, sort of a thing. So there are a lot of themes. Nachiket, you asked a question. Just 1 second. When you say when you said what you said about monstrosity reminds me of Apala from the Rig Veda, whose body is covered with scales like a snake, and whose Indra has to contend with and cure and slay. That is true. In fact, I must say that the word Apala is also associated with Vitra. It's also a different being. There's a lot of confusion. To be honest, the Indra. I also mentioned Varun and Agni, right? There are verses which almost make it seem like Indra is Varun, Indra is Agni. That's just his different name. So the same thing happens whenever serpent is mentioned. Even you're saying Apala or Ahi. That's the word that has been used in the Rig Veda to describe the serpent. Now it's not very clear they're the same people or they're different people. I personally, the way I think about it is, it's almost like when we are referring to the superheroes, right? Now, if I'm referring to the word Batman, you know that I'm talking about a guy who turns into Batman, but am I referring to the Christopher Nolan's Batman? Am I referring to the comic book Batman? Am I referring to the DCEU Batman? You don't know, and all of them have slight differences. So I think what has happened is the Vedic stories have actually been lost to us, the different versions, and the Rig Vedas and all are basically hymns which are celebrating one of the gods, or just the overall gods in holistic view. So yeah, that was the story. But thanks for pointing that out. I think that's true. Vedas have these very interesting stories with some random mentions. In fact, there was one random line which completely threw me off to the point that I was going to take away the story, not to mention it. In one of the lines, it's mentioned that it's Saraswati who slays Vitra, and that's not been mentioned anywhere else. Literally, I scoured through almost 15 to 20 mandalas before I kind of just gave up on the idea that ki Saraswati is thing, and it's not very clear why is suddenly Saraswati mentioned in the middle of a story, that it's Saraswati is being praised and she's mentioned as the killing the thing, and I was like, okay, that completely changes the story, if it's someone else who's killed it. But I think that's mythology for you. Clarity cannot come without confusion. So yeah. So yeah, guys, I hope you enjoyed this session. This has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing this. This was an absolute pleasure to be talking about this. I'm going to be coming back with more stories, more ideas and all. Feel free to put it on comments, or even send me your ideas of any particular myth you want me to talk about, cover, or you're interested in. I am also going to be doing a lot of retellings of the stories itself, not just in summarizing the stories that the way I did it, but also retellings from a point of view of making you see the character in their own in their own reality. So yeah, so this was Mythematical, and I am your seriously confused mathematician and your host. Until next time, thank you everyone.